Before we maybe can talk more about your own practice, recent projects, and the recent projects with Anish, I have one more question about your dialogue and your collaboration with Rem, because I found this quote when Rem said that neither of both of you is interested in radicality per se. It's more of a kind of resistance to the obvious or a further investigation of the obvious. Could you talk about this?
Yeah. With Kohlhaas, we had a strap line that we always used even at the beginning, stupid but smart. And that was also evident here in Casa de Musica. Also with Rem, I had these notions. He was flexing his muscles with urban accident, the urbanist project with the form and the tectonic. I was working with the structure and the tectonic and space. So we had these interesting moments. But we achieved this kind of idea that, that somehow a form should not have a purity, that it should do the general thing it should do, but then specific interventions would come all the time. And those specific interventions were entirely structural, so that when Herzog and de Meuron went around the Kunsthalle, they were shocked and said to Rem, "My God, this is a structural project. We never understood you were interested in structure." But of course they got that wrong too. It wasn't about structure. The Kunsthalle was about a multi-sequencing of frame. And if you ask me, and where is the conceptual model of Rem's work in the three models I showed, the center is actually on the border with Rem. His work, like this project as well, keeps remaking borders in a conceptual sense. The frameworks are being moved. And so here in Casa Musica, the early designs had very fat walls to take 28, 30-meter spans, but I shrunk it deliberately to about 40, 50 centimeters only, and then put in props and events to make the thing work. The same thing happened in Seattle, which is the inverse, the Seattle Library is the inverse of this project. So Rem and I developed this kind of stupid but smart mantra, and it became almost a telepathic thing, which I can't explain, but I would like to share with you, Hans, and the audience. Rarely known, I suppose. We have our teams work, we conceive the project, but whenever we get back, something happens at the table that neither of us can explain, and it's not his skill or my skill. There's something else, just completely, suddenly, the whole idea jumps into something else, and it's a very strange experience. I've only basically had that with Rem.
Can you tell me maybe a bit about how that telepathy worked with CCTV?
With CCTV, it goes back in a tradition of 10 years of trying to think and imagine what a tower would be. And I always thought, because of Delirious New York, that Kohlhaas should do a tower in the States. And but we never did one. But we kept imagining towers that had various configurations. And then there was a magic project in Seoul, which the client said he wanted the most slender tower in the world. And I came up with a 420-meter high tower, which was only 20 meters wide, which really is impossible if you look at it. But the way to do it was with certain attachments to it. And if you look at that project, you'll find the seeds of CCTV. Where you go up, along, out in space and back. And so the telepathy worked there by faxing at 11 in the night, the first time we started that night, and me somehow understanding that the building was about skin and not about any other thing. It certainly could not be spine in any way. And so that intuition, and I scribbled a mess on the whole surface, which then ended up in one of the simplest algorithms, half or two. If one is the norm, halve it or double it. And that led to the entire skin working in a way that takes your eye into the form. So that was a kind of telepathic moment. Also the handling of huge scale. We were both completely out of our normal comfort zone in the scale. It was absolutely huge. And we kept building, Rem kept building, like 4-meter high models to just get us to feel the scale of what we were working at.
Your collaboration with Anish Kapoor has also to do with scale. It all started with a very, very large installation in the turbine hall, and has ever since grown into much more architectural proportion. Can you tell me how that collaboration with Anish works, and is there also a telepathy at stake?
Well, what happened with Kapoor is that, like all artists, he works with a studio, and his work was, the early work that you've seen, up to 2000, was 3 meters high, 4 meters high, maximum, maybe 2 meters generally, mirrors, bent forms, inverted form. And then the commission came to do the big, to take the Tate Modern in its hall, and Kapoor's first response to that was to take a work he had done in the north of England, which was like an African drum, a kind of a volute shape, an inverted sort of attenuation, small, and put 2 of them into the Tate. And that's what I said about in my talk about configuration mattering linked to material. I just knew, and I sensed, why are we putting 2 bits into this hall when only 1 bit should be there? There should be only one thing. And then understanding the scale of 140 meters, and then somehow intuiting that the fabric, only 1 millimeter thick, could stretch 140 meters, forming something, was the proposal I made to Kapoor. And so from 2 parts, it became 1, and the whole synthesis happened. And since then, Anish realized that at big scale, he has to work with somebody else, and that it has to be a genuine shared concept, because it was very nervous as an artist to give up control. He was most temperamental, most difficult at those moments, but that's part of it. Now, of course, we have established this kind of dialogue about event horizon, and that's really all we talk about. In the recent work we opened in north of England 5 days ago, I think is a classic of where the form is seen but it's not obvious, and yet it is, and it's got a sequence of narrative between disembodiment and embodiment.
So that's the Middlesbrough project, which just opened this week, and it's interesting because whenever I visit Anish's studio over the last couple of years, I ask him what are his unrealized projects, and very often there were these almost utopic projects he developed with you, and now one after the other they're actually getting built. So Middlesbrough is built, and the next one is obviously the project for the Olympics in 2012. Now, at the basically launch of this, there were many comparisons made in relation to the Eiffel Tower and what could be an Eiffel Tower or analog to the Eiffel Tower for our age. Could you talk a little bit about the genesis of this project for the Olympic?
The Olympic project came by us sitting again and thinking, what do we do? Because the brief was calling for at least 120 meter high tower. And apart from observation deck, I started to think and analyze that the tower form, and Eiffel was the reference, that it's a completely extenuated form, attenuated, constantly connected to itself, and this constant extrusion of the form. And so, just as in the Bordeaux Villa came that moment when I decided to push the columns outside the form, completely transforming the picture of the footprint, I realized that somehow, instead of a continuous form, that I could pick up points in space that would still give the hologram almost of a continuous form. So that continuity of structure need not be completely extruded like this, because it's also quite wasteful. It could be just connected at moments, like a cloud. And I came up then with the idea that an orbit that could pass by itself and connect to itself would give, in the end, enough of points to take a load down to the ground without being restricted between the points. And so the genesis ultimately then was a kind of ellipsoid in space, which the focus of the ellipse, the foci, the 2 focuses, became attractor points, and a surface particle mold around it. And by this time, of our 8 years of work with Anish, he has completely embraced, I'd like to think I've infected him with a whole language which he now uses of non-linear and instability or apparent instability coming from indeterminate form. And it's interesting that the architects completely have misunderstood the form, because they are basically inheriting the classical model, thinking in section and plan, and they cannot see the three-dimensionality of the orbit. Yet the artists who've seen the form have responded very positively. And so also has the engineering fraternity. But architects have been left out, interestingly.
But also, I suppose it has a lot to do with you having more and more these parallel realities, and there is your work as an engineer, there is your work as an artist doing installations, there is your work as an architect, and maybe we can talk in the last part of the interview a little bit about these parallel realities. But I had a last question about your collaboration with someone else, because obviously I think it's important to speak about your collaboration with Álvaro Siza and Eduardo Souto de Moura. And I remember when we did the interview for the Serpentine Pavilion, which is this project Julia Peyton-Johns has invented in 2000 with Zaha Hadid, and which now goes in its 10th years. And actually the Souto de Moura and Siza Pavilion was a very, very important pavilion. And you told me in a previous interview about this invention in relation to this pavilion. So I thought it would be interesting if you could tell us more about this.
Well, I think with it's happenstance that I'm in Portugal talking about this, but I was just looking at some slides before I put these together this morning. And I think it's not very well known, but the first time I ever used an algorithm to actually, to my shock, manipulate space and create a tectonic element was the roof to the Hanover Expo, which Cesar and I did, and Sotomora was doing the interior at the time. And I was astonished. Cesar and I sat in his office trying to imagine a waveform, and I was doing the classical way architects do a waveform with 2D cuts, and then trying to extrapolate between and loft it. And so, in a way, the very first algorithmic movement I did was with an old master like Cesar, and he totally embraced it. And I was quite shocked that someone who had come from idea of masonry and stone form and small span form was into fabric and a kind of, and of course it's the openness of Cesar. And since then, we have struck up a great friendship, and I find Cesar's mind very fertile and a great historian. So most of the time I spend with Cesar is talking about history, and I learned a lot from him that way. And on the Serpentine Pavilion, we did a grid together, but then I decided and proposed to him that the grid should shuffle. And that was for me a very important point. Up till then, all timber grid shells are concentric, or all grids in structural terms and architectural terms are seen as concentric. That means the centroid of one element goes through the other element in plane. With the Caesar Pavilion there, I started to shift the grid, and so nothing's concentric. And it's another classic example of the cascade, and actually a most primitive algorithm of just simple displacement that then runs right through the form. And literally, those who were in that building remembers this sort of wonderful moment of vibrancy, even though it was a simple grid shell. So Cesar, and he has remained absolutely firm in his support and commitment, and he always talks in public very generously of 4 hands were at work when we work together. At his RIBA lecture as well, when he's got his gold medal, he said with Cecil, we have 4 hands working together.
After these many, many projects you did in collaboration with architects, there is another very important moment when your own architectural project started, and there is this link to Portugal. You mentioned the project in Coimbra, the bridge, and I was wondering if there was an epiphany there. What triggered this moment of you doing architecture?
I think doing architecture really was a whole process of 20 years, because basically I've been working as an architect with Rem and with Libeskind, making the forms as a partner in architecture. And as I said, the engineering has never been paramount of interest to me. It's been the last thing that drops out